All right, so moving into complex sounds, we are going to do a very quick review of what timbre is. And so timbre, and I know that my big fat head is covering up a couple of this, some of this figure, but this is in your textbook because I like this figure. Basically, what timbre is we are playing a middle C. So if you're not familiar with music, that's okay, but basically we're playing one sound at one pitch and one volume, but we're playing it through a piano, a trombone, and a tenor saxophone. We're also going to be making that same pitch using a vocal ah sound, an E sound, and an O sound. So these vowel sounds mix with these different instruments. Now, what's interesting about all these is that if we were to calculate the pitch and the volume, we would not see any differences for these sound waves. But you can tell they're different, right? You can tell that these things all look very different. And so you can see how these sounds are created in different ways, but they may have the same pitch and the same volume. That's the timbre of the sound. So you may remember last chapter I kind of played, a couple of different instruments and told you, this is the same volume and the same pitch. They just sound different. That's what timbre is. So timbre, again, is the psychological sensation that we detect that are different between two sounds whenever we have the loudness and the pitch that are the same. So the perception of timbre is going to change based on the context in which we hear it, which basically means in the ways that the sound is generated, which we talked a little bit about in chapter 9 about how, like, for example, a flute, when you play into a flute, that creates sound in a very different way than a trumpet does, right? If you think about all the tubing and the valves, it's all very different. And the differences in those instruments help create the timbre. They help create the differences in these sound waves. What we haven't talked about is the architecture of the room. The architecture of the room is also going to affect the timbre of a sound. This is part of the reason why whenever musicians go into recording studios, they have very specific demands for the layout of a room. Usually you're going to have a lot of sound dampening, so you'll have like a rug, you'll have maybe some egg cartons, or foam on the walls to help soak up the sound, but you're not going to have a music studio that is as big as a house, right? You're going to have smaller rooms, and the reason for that is because the size of those rooms is going to help contribute to the timbre of that sound. It's part of the reason why bands sound differently live, or singers sound differently live in a concert or on a stage than they do whenever they are in a studio, whenever you're hearing them, with headphones. So auditory constancy is going to be something that we use to help make sure that all the different sounds and echoes that we hear are all contributing to one experience. So, I'm going to come back to this idea in just a second. I want to give you a visual representation of this. So let's say that we have somebody up here singing. I guess this is Taylor Swift. She's up here, she's singing. And if you are, and this is Taylor Swift's really early days because there's only two people here, but let's say that you were sitting in the audience. If you're sitting in the audience, we have these two different viewpoints. So this particular person, what is he hearing? You could say he's hearing the musician, and you're absolutely right. However, the sound doesn't simply go straight from her mouth to his face or from her guitar straight to his face. Instead, it's going to reverberate all over the room. So you can kind of see that here. And these aren't the only directions, but just a couple of representations where we're going to have her voice is going to, those sound waves are going to bounce off the wall behind her, bounce off the ceiling, and then come and then hit this perspective, his ears. We're going to have it directly. We're going to have it come off the baseboards of the stage. We're going to have it move, hit the ceiling, hit the wall behind them, and then hit them from this direction. And so we have a lot going on all at once. We have a lot of different kinds of sounds. However, we don't perceive her as having 100 different voices, right? We hear her as only having one voice, even though, as you can see, these sound waves are not all going to reach this particular person at the exact same time. They're all going to be at slightly different intervals. But our brain is going to collapse across that and basically determine that, oh, this is one source. And so we're going to take all of these sounds and combine them into one experience. So we hear the same pitch even though there are echoes, even though there are reverberations in this stage around them. And so that's what we mean by auditory constancy. You may remember when we were talking about color in chapter 5 about how if there's a shadow across a color, we still perceive it as the same color. We just perceive it as being a little bit darker than usual because there's a shadow falling across it. In other words, we discount the effects of the shadow. We're doing the exact same thing here, where we are discounting the effects of the distance and of the echo. So even though some of these sounds travel different distances, which makes them a lower pitch, which makes them a little bit softer volume, we still perceive it as all coming from this one individual person, and that is auditory constancy. A very quick kind of sidebar, if you are interested in how music is made, if you are a songwriter or whatever, there's a book that I really enjoy that I think you might like too, and it's called How Music Works. And How Music Works is written by a guy named David Byrne, who is this guy right here. And if you're thinking, hey, doesn't that look like the same suit that Kanye West used in that one kind of funny video? Yeah, it does look exactly the same. But basically he's the singer for Talking Heads. You may know Talking Heads because they would always put on these really weird live shows in the 80s. Where he would wear these gigantic suits and just look kind of silly. But he wrote a book about kind of sound and how sound is manipulated by different artists. And so it's a good book, but I especially recommend the first chapter. The first chapter, he's talking specifically about the architecture of rooms and how the architecture of rooms changes how songwriters write their music. And so basically what he says is that, back in the 70s, in the early 70s, where you had bands like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, and these were the big bands of the time, that sound is written to basically be played in stadiums. It's music that was meant to be played live and meant to be played in arenas with large audiences. That's why it's bombastic and it's loud, because it's meant to travel a long distance. But then if you look at some of the music that his band made, back in the 80s, bands then were playing kind of dingy clubs, right? They were playing dingy clubs in New York and things like that. And because of that, their sound was aimed towards creating, really dense kinds of songs, because they were thinking about how are these songs going to sound live, because that's how they practice. And so that's how they write their music. And now, today, thinking about music for today, music is created thinking about the digital age. That's why a lot of the songs that we have now, they usually sound best played through a set of earbuds or a set of headphones. They don't sound all that great played live. They don't sound all that great played through our TV or through our speakers, for those reasons. So anyways, basically what I'm trying to say is that whenever songwriters are coming up with their music, they have to be thinking about the way that the setting in which that music is heard, because that's going to change the songwriting process. All right, more on that in chapter 11 when we talk a little bit more about music perception. All right, so moving back into auditory constancy, whenever we are processing different sounds, we can break it up into independent units if we wanted to. And usually whenever we are anywhere, we're going to hear lots of sounds all at once. And so how are we able to tell these sounds apart? Because one of the really fascinating things, at least to me, is that if you were to just record a sound, for example, you can actually take out, your phone and you can record a voice memo or something like that. And you can look at the sound wave and it just looks like a bunch of squiggles, right? But then if you were to play it back, you can hear if there are multiple people around you. You can hear if there is a dog barking. You can hear if the television is on. But you can't determine any of that just by looking at the sound wave. So the question is, how are we able to take that sound wave and break it apart into its individual components? So there are a couple of ways in which we do that. We can look at the spatial separation, so we can determine whether or not sounds are coming from different areas of the room around us, which we talked a little bit about when we were talking about intraaural time differences and things like that. So we can determine that, but we can also think about the timing and the sound of particular things. So the two that I'm going to focus on here are grouping by onset and grouping by timbre. And so I'm going to show you these very quickly instead of just reciting these definitions. So here we are grouping by timbre. So just take a look at panel D right here. Panel D looks like there's a bunch of noise, a little bit of noise, and then a bunch of noise again, right? Okay, so if we were to play this out, we would hear a frog, a bird, and a splash. So basically we're taking panel A, which is a frog, panel B, which is a bird, and panel C, which is a splash. We're combining them all together, and that is what we are hearing here. And so grouping by timbre basically means that when we are listening to something, we hear a sound that seems to be created from one source, a frog in this case, another source, the bird, and a different source, a splash. And so whenever we hear this, panel D, which is all of this happening at once, our brains are still able to pick out, okay, it sounds like there are three potential sources here, a frog, a bird, and a splash. So we're able to take out these sounds because they all sound like they're coming from the same source, which is going to help us interpret this complete mess of a sound wave over here. So that's grouping by timbre. Grouping by timbre basically means that different kinds of patterns seem to pop out based on how they sound. I think another kind of cool example of this, and I keep talking about music, but let's say that you have that you are interested in like a piano part or something like that, or a guitar solo. It doesn't matter. So you're listening to this song, and if you are listening out for that particular piano part or that electric guitar sound, what you're doing is you're trying to isolate which of these tones sound like they came from the same source. That is grouping timbre. So grouping by timbre. The next part is going to be grouping by onset, and that is how we tend to group things that seem like they are happening at the same time. And so here is kind of a cool example of, and I don't have an audio file to play this, but this particular sound is a bouncing ball. So you have a ball and you drop it, and you can kind of see here that basically what you would hear is boom, 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 boom. So it's kind of like if you were to drop a ball and it's, right? So if you were just to hear that, it would sound like, okay, this is one object and it is bouncing. That it hit and then it hit a little bit more softly. So we can take all these same sounds, and if we just take away this very orderly onset where we have one starting, and you can kind of see here that it immediately starts, if we were to take that away and blur some of that a little bit, we have all the same sounds, but they're all kind of playing at different intervals, then it just sounds like something is being broken. It just sounds like something is being torn up. It sounds like something is being trashed. And so we can't determine if it's one or more sources, one or more different things in the sound wave. We just hear it as a cacophony, just a bunch of noise. All right, so harmonics is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about next chapter, so I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but our textbook authors wanted to bring it up here as a way of talking about the fundamental frequency. The fundamental frequency is an idea we're going to see in chapter 11, but basically the idea is that you can take this very rich kind of sound wave, and if you isolate the loudest, lowest pitch, which is almost always going to be that fundamental frequency, which is a fancy way of saying that is the tone of that sound. If you were to take that away, but leave all these other sounds that are also happening, then you will still hear this as that particular tone. So, what the hell does that mean? Basically what it means is that if we were to play a sound of a recording of my voice, and let's say that I'm trying to speak very monotonely, so I'm trying to speak all at one pitch, not alter my pitch at all. It is the same pitch. It is a C flat or whatever, or a C sharp. So if I'm saying that, and I were to take that sound wave and I were to look at it, it's going to look like a mess, right? Because we have lots of different kinds of sounds that are all being created all at once because of our vocal cords. Our vocal cords are not just going to emit one sound, they're going to emit multiple sounds all at once. And so we're going to have something like this where we're going to have one pitch that is really loud, one pitch that is a little bit lower, one pitch that is a little bit lower, but we're going to have all these sounds all played at once, so they all have basically the same kind of relationship with one another. If we were to take that recording of my voice, take out that C sharp, that lowest defining pitch, if we were to take it out, we're still going to perceive that voice as being both my voice and a C sharp because of the relationship that all these other harmonics have with one another. Again, we'll talk about that more in chapter 11, and I'll even give you a couple of examples when I break out my piano and play it for you. So let's wrap this chapter up by talking about sound continuity. So this video is going to be a little bit longer than the others, but we're just going to squeeze in this little bit here. So just like when we were talking about the Gestalt grouping principles, you can kind of think about grouping by timbre and grouping by onset as a pair of Gestalt grouping principles. You can also see that for sound, we have something very similar to the principle of good continuation. And basically what that means is that if you were to listen to something and then you hear like a burst of static or a car horn honking, that you would still assume, you would still perceive that I was talking even if I immediately cut off. So if I took this video right here, and I don't have the editing tools to do this right now, but let's say that I had this, that I was talking to you right now, and then I had like a censor sound, like I had said a bad word, like I said hell or something like that, and I was censoring myself, so you have that doot, that beep sound to censor me. Whenever we hear people talking on TV, and you have that censor, you have that bleeping, we still perceive that bleeping is covering up something, right? It sounds like that word is being covered up. It sounds like that word still exists, but that it is being shadowed by this other sound. That is the principle of good continuation. Because if we wanted to, we could actually do that exact same experiment of bleeping some sounds, but actually have me not say anything, like, oh, my computer is such a piece of bleep, right? If I said, oh, my computer is such a piece of, and had that bleeping sound anyways, we'd still perceive that I had said something that was bleeped out or that was covered up. So we still, quote unquote, hear the sound even though something has covered it up, or even if we've just removed it completely. But if it sounds like it's being covered up, then we perceive it as still being there. So, it doesn't really work all that well with silence, which is basically if we took, for example, instead of having that bleeping sound, if we just dropped the audio out, if we just made it silent, we would not perceive that individual was still talking. And this is part of the reason why TV shows and radio ads will use bleeping, is because we don't want people to think that that person just stopped talking, right? Even if they didn't say a bad word, we still want them to think that they did, right? So we don't just use silence, we use different sounds. Maybe it's static, maybe it's a bleeping sound to cover that up. So it works for sounds, it works for music, it works for speech, and so we're basically going to be using top-down processing, basically our pre-existing knowledge of how the world works, of what language is, to fill in these missing words or these missing cues. Inattentional deafness is something that we talk more about in cognitive psychology, but our textbook talks about it a little bit here. But basically, inattentional deafness is whenever we hear things all around us, but we tune them out. So, for example, if you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, husband or a wife or whatever, and you're sitting next to them and they're talking to you, and you're thinking about the football game, you're thinking about work or something like that, and then they ask you, "Did you hear me?" On one hand, yeah, your ears definitely pick that up, right? Because you're sitting right next to them. So yeah, your ears pick that up, but you didn't actually hear them, right? And that's because our attention was not focused on them, right? And so our attention can create a form of quote unquote deafness. That's the phrase that they use here, because even though our ears still pick it up, it doesn't make its way to the brain. So based on our brain activity doesn't hear that person sitting right next to us because we're not paying them attention. And so this is a phenomenon that we have trouble with because our brains are only really good at perceiving one stream of auditory information at once. So if you're locked into a football game or a movie or a video game and somebody's talking to you, but you're listening to that commentator or that character or whatever, you will block out the surrounding noise. And that's because that's just how our attention works. So we're only really able to follow one stream of information at a time. This video right here will kind of give you an example of that. And so, yeah, basically our ears are still working, but our brains are kind of tuning out these different things, which is what they call inattentional deafness. Very similar to inattentional blindness. How if you're really focused on one thing, you can miss out on things in your periphery. The final thing, the acoustic startle reflex, is a reflex that we have whenever we hear a really loud sound. We tend to move towards it. And so usually whenever I am in the classroom, I will demonstrate this by walking to the back, having people look straight ahead, and then shouting, making a really loud sound. Your instinct is to pivot around and swivel and see what the hell's going on, right? That's your instinct. That is a very natural reflex that we have. And when we hear a loud sound, we jump up and we get ready to move, right? To see where that sound is coming from. This response is very fast. It doesn't need to be learned. Babies have it. And it's because there's only a few neurons that help govern this particular reflex. That's part of the reason why it's so fast. So basically that's pretty much it. Here's a cool example of dichotic listening with music. This is a song from the Velvet Underground, which is a really early example of these musicians who took a song, and so you would want to listen to this with headphones where you have one ear is hearing the sound, one ear is hearing the person speaking, the person singing, and it creates a very uneasy, very strange feeling because it sounds like two completely different things happening at once, because that's how our brain is interpreting it, that these are two separate sounds that are happening at once, not that it's one sound. So even though, for example, most of the music that we hear, both ears are hearing both versions of the same song, so we perceive it as one source. In this particular example, we kind of perceive it as two separate entities because each ear is getting a different channel. All right, that's it for this chapter. Next chapter, we're going to be talking about speech. We're going to be talking about music. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you there. Bye.